May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across America, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets in celebration. In prisoner of war camps from Texas to New York, German soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a small facility outside Fort Devens, Massachusetts, something unprecedented was happening. When American commanders announced to a group of German women prisoners that they were free to return home, many of them did the unthinkable. They begged to stay. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final months of the war in Europe. Young women who had served the Reich in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than return to freedom in their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, in November 1944, when the first group of German women prisoners arrived at the makeshift facility. Unlike male POW camps, this smaller compound housed fewer than 60 women, ranging in age from 18 to 35. They had been captured in France and Belgium as German forces retreated, serving as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht. Captain Margaret Sullivan, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the facility, remembered her first encounter with the prisoners. The women stepped off the transport truck with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty in their eyes. They wore remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia they had once worn with pride. Among them was 23-year-old Ingrid Brenner, a former communications specialist from Hamburg. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was serving her country's defense. Now, standing in an American prison camp, she clutched a small leather diary that contained the only remaining connection to her previous life. The first weeks were tense. The German women kept to themselves, speaking only in hushed German conversations during mealtimes. They followed camp routines mechanically, their faces masks of resigned dignity. Captain Sullivan noticed how they maintained military bearing even in captivity, standing straighter than many of her own soldiers. But something began to change as autumn turned to winter. It started with small gestures from the American guards and staff. Private James Morrison, a farm boy from Iowa, noticed that one of the German women, a slight blonde named Anna Weber, appeared to be fighting off a persistent cough. Without asking permission, he brought her an extra blanket and a cup of hot tea made from herbs his grandmother had taught him about. Anna looked at him with surprise, her blue eyes reflecting confusion at this unexpected kindness. She had been taught that American soldiers were ruthless enemies. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her own brother, showing concern for her well-being. She accepted the tea with a quiet "Danke," and for the first time since her capture, her rigid posture softened slightly. Word of such small kindnesses spread through the compound. Guard Sergeant Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, understood what it meant to be seen as different, as foreign. He began teaching basic English phrases to any prisoner who showed interest, using hand gestures and drawings when words failed. Ingrid found herself drawn to these impromptu lessons. She had studied some English in school and discovered she had an aptitude for languages. More importantly, she began to see something in the Americans' faces that contradicted everything she had been told about them. Instead of hatred, she saw curiosity. Instead of cruelty, she witnessed unexpected moments of humanity. Christmas of 1944 brought the first major breakthrough. Captain Sullivan had wrestled with how to handle the holiday, knowing that many of her German prisoners were likely homesick and struggling with depression. She decided to organize a modest celebration, allowing the women to create simple decorations from available materials. What happened next surprised everyone. Ingrid approached Captain Sullivan with a hesitant request, speaking in her careful accented English. "Captain, may we sing for you? German Christmas songs, but also..." She paused, searching for words. "We try to learn American songs." That evening, in the camp's main hall, 60 German women stood before their American captors and sang. They began with "O Tannenbaum," their voices harmonizing with the natural precision of their musical tradition. But then something remarkable happened. They attempted "Silent Night" in English, their pronunciation imperfect, but their intention clear. Private Morrison later wrote to his family, "Ma, I never thought I'd say this, but listening to those German gals sing tonight, I forgot for a moment that we were enemies. They looked so young, so far from home. Made me think of Sarah and her friends back in Cedar Rapids. The evening marked a turning point. Conversations between guards and prisoners became more frequent. The German women began to volunteer for additional work duties, not out of obligation, but from what appeared to be genuine desire to contribute. They helped in the kitchen, mended uniforms, and some with medical training assisted the camp nurse. Ingrid found herself becoming an unofficial translator and mediator. Her English improved rapidly, and she began to serve as a bridge between the two groups. She discovered that many of the American soldiers were just as homesick as the German prisoners, just as uncertain about what the future would bring. By February 1945, the dynamics in the camp had shifted dramatically. The German women no longer sat apart during meals. Conversations in mixed English and German could be heard throughout the compound. Guard Sergeant Chen had organized informal classes, where prisoners taught German phrases while learning more English in return. But it was the arrival of disturbing news from Germany that truly changed everything. As Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, reports began filtering back about the conditions they were discovering. Stories of concentration camps, of systematic atrocities, of a level of horror that most ordinary Germans claimed never to have known existed. Ingrid sat in the camp library reading American newspapers with growing shock and disbelief. The images were grainy, but the accompanying descriptions were clear enough. Her hands trembled as she read accounts of Bergen-Belsen, of Dachau, of places she had never heard of, but which apparently existed in the same country she had proudly served. Anna Weber found her there, tears streaming down her face. "Ingrid," she whispered in German, "is this real? Did our country really do these things?" Other women gathered around the newspapers, their faces reflecting the same confusion and horror. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but young women who had joined auxiliary services believing they were defending their homeland. Now they were confronting the possibility that they had been part of something far darker than they had ever imagined. Captain Sullivan watched from across the room as the German women grappled with this new reality. She had seen the same shock on the faces of German prisoners when similar revelations emerged, but she had never witnessed such genuine anguish, such complete devastation of everything these women had believed about their own identity. That night, Ingrid wrote in her diary, "What kind of Germany will we return to? What kind of Germany were we serving? I thought I knew who I was, what I believed in. Now I understand nothing." Spring of 1945 brought victory in Europe, but also profound uncertainty for the German prisoners at Fort Devens. Repatriation procedures began for male POWs across the country, but the situation for the 60 women remained unclear. Officials in Washington debated their status while the women themselves faced an agonizing question: what did they want to return to? Reports from Germany painted a picture of devastation. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered or dead, and the country they had once known no longer existed. Many of the women had lost contact with their families months or even years earlier. They had no way of knowing who, if anyone, was waiting for their return. Meanwhile, their daily life in the American camp had evolved into something none of them had expected. What had begun as captivity had transformed into something approaching community. The American staff no longer treated them as enemy prisoners, but as displaced persons caught in circumstances beyond their control. Ingrid had been corresponding with a local family, the Hendersons, who had begun visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program. Mrs. Henderson, a schoolteacher, had been impressed by Ingrid's intelligence and her rapid mastery of English. More importantly, she had been moved by the young woman's genuine remorse about the revelations regarding her country's actions. "You're not responsible for things you never knew about," Mrs. Henderson had told her during one of their conversations. "The question is what you do with the knowledge you have now." But forgiveness from Americans was one thing. The women knew they would face a very different reception if they returned to Germany. They would be seen as failures, as soldiers who had been captured and corrupted by enemy influence. Worse, they would return to a country that no longer reflected the values they thought they had been fighting for. As the official announcement of their impending repatriation approached, the conversations among the German women grew more intense and more desperate. They had found something in this American prison camp that many of them had never experienced before: acceptance, purpose, and the possibility of redemption. The morning of May 15, 1945, arrived with unusual tension in the camp. Captain Sullivan had called a general assembly for all German prisoners to announce the official repatriation procedures. The 60 women gathered in the main hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean for their futures. Captain Sullivan stood before them, holding official documents from the War Department. Her voice was steady but compassionate as she began to speak. "Ladies, I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Germany. Transportation will be arranged within the next 2 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes." She paused, observing the mixture of relief and anxiety on their faces. What she didn't expect was what happened next. Ingrid Brenner stood up slowly, her hands visibly shaking. In clear, careful English, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Sullivan, may I speak for some of us?" Permission granted, Ingrid looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Several American guards exchanged confused glances. Anna Weber stood next, followed by 12 other women. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made after long deliberation. Anna spoke in halting English. "Captain, we know what we are asking is unusual, but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." Captain Sullivan was momentarily speechless. In all her military experience, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. She asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Ingrid explained that they had written to the International Red Cross, trying to locate their families. Of the 14 women who wished to stay, only 3 had received any news from home. 2 had learned that their entire families were dead, killed in Allied bombing raids. The others faced complete uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived the war. More than that, they had found something in the American camp that they feared losing. "Here," Ingrid continued, "we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given the chance to work, to contribute, to become better people than we were when we arrived." The implications of their request were staggering. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided for their repatriation, not for extended residence in the United States. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures. Private Morrison, who had shown Anna Weber that first act of kindness months earlier, approached Captain Sullivan after the assembly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong." That evening, Captain Sullivan sent an urgent telegram to her superiors in Washington, describing the unprecedented situation. The response would take days to arrive, leaving everyone in a strange state of limbo. The women who had chosen to stay continued their daily routines, but with a new intensity, as if trying to prove their worthiness for the unprecedented request they had made. While waiting for official word from Washington, life in the camp took on an almost surreal quality. The women who had requested to stay threw themselves into their work with renewed purpose, as if their contributions might influence the decision being made hundreds of miles away. But their efforts revealed something deeper than mere strategy. They had genuinely found meaning in their daily activities. Ingrid had become indispensable as a translator, not just for languages but for cultural understanding. She helped mediate disputes between other prisoners, assisted in administrative duties, and had begun teaching German to several American staff members who were curious about the language. Her diary entries from this period reveal a woman discovering talents and interests she never knew she possessed. Anna Weber had found her calling working with the camp's medical officer, Dr. Robert Hayes. Her careful attention to detail and natural empathy made her an excellent nursing assistant. Dr. Hayes, initially skeptical of having a German prisoner in his medical facility, had become one of her strongest advocates. "She has a gift for healing," he told Captain Sullivan. "It would be a shame to waste that gift." The other women had similarly found their niches. Maria Gottschalk, a former administrative clerk, had revolutionized the camp's record-keeping system. Greta Hoffman had discovered a talent for mechanical repairs, fixing everything from kitchen equipment to vehicles. Each woman was becoming, in her own way, indispensable to the daily operation of the facility. But their integration wasn't without controversy. Word of the German women's request had leaked to nearby communities, and reaction was mixed. Some local newspapers ran editorials questioning why Nazi prisoners should be allowed special treatment when American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific Theater. Others, particularly from church groups that had interacted with the women, wrote letters of support emphasizing their obvious transformation and genuine remorse. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher who had befriended Ingrid, organized a delegation of local residents to meet with camp officials. "These women aren't the same people who were brought here 8 months ago," she argued. "They've shown us what redemption can look like when people are given the chance to change." The debate reached beyond the local level. Newspapers in Boston and New York picked up the story, with headlines ranging from "Nazi prisoners refuse freedom" to "Captured women find new life in America." The story became a symbol of larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of human transformation. Meanwhile, letters began arriving from other POW camps across the country. German prisoners elsewhere had heard about the women at Fort Devens and were writing to express their own conflicted feelings about repatriation. Some requested transfers to the Massachusetts facility, hoping to delay their own return to Germany. The ripple effects of the women's unprecedented request were spreading far beyond anyone's expectations. During this tense waiting period, an unexpected visitor arrived at the camp. Father Heinrich Miller, a German-American priest from nearby Worcester, had requested permission to speak with the women in their native language. Captain Sullivan, hoping that pastoral guidance might help resolve the situation, granted the request. Father Muller's conversation with the women lasted 3 hours and proved to be a turning point in their understanding of their situation. Speaking in German, he helped them articulate feelings they had been struggling to express in English, but more importantly, he challenged them to consider the full implications of their choice. Lucerne. Father Miller's visit had forced the women to confront uncomfortable truths about their decision to stay. Speaking in German for the first time in months, they were able to express complex emotions that had been building inside them. But the priest didn't offer easy comfort or simple solutions. Instead, he asked them difficult questions about duty, identity, and the meaning of home. "You speak of finding kindness here," he said to the gathered women. "But what about the kindness you could show to others in Germany who are suffering? You talk about Germany not being your home anymore, but isn't that exactly when home needs you most? When it's broken and needs rebuilding?" Ingrid found herself challenged by these words. She had been so focused on what returning to Germany would cost her that she hadn't considered what staying in America might cost others. Were they being selfish in choosing the easier path? Was their desire to stay driven by genuine principle, or simply by fear of facing the consequences of their country's actions? The priest's visit sparked intense discussions among the women. Some began to reconsider their decision, wondering if their duty lay in returning to help rebuild their devastated homeland. Others felt even more convinced that they could serve better by becoming examples of transformation and reconciliation in America. These internal debates were interrupted by the arrival of Captain Sullivan's orders from Washington. The response was characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent the repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. The decision meant that the women would no longer be prisoners of war, but they also would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the camp. They would need to find sponsors, employment, and housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was, in many ways, a more daunting prospect than simply returning to Germany. The announcement divided the 14 women who had originally requested to stay. 5 decided that the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage and hope. But 9 women, led by Ingrid and Anna, chose to accept the challenge of starting completely new lives in America. The process of finding sponsors and employment proved easier than anyone had expected. The Henderson family immediately offered to sponsor Ingrid, providing housing and support while she sought employment as a translator. Dr. Hayes arranged for Anna to continue her medical training at a local hospital, promising to supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse. Other local families, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity, stepped forward to offer support. The same communities that had initially been suspicious of having German prisoners nearby now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as a uniquely American story of redemption and second chances. But perhaps the most significant development was the decision made by several of the women who had chosen repatriation. They announced that they intended to return to Germany not as defeated prisoners, but as ambassadors of the reconciliation they had experienced in America. They wanted to carry back the lessons they had learned about forgiveness, cooperation, and the possibility of former enemies becoming friends. The final repatriation day arrived on June 20th, 1945. The scene at Fort Devens was unlike anything in the history of American prisoner of war operations. Instead of the usual tense formal processing of defeated enemies being returned to their homeland, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell gathering. The 46 women who had chosen repatriation stood in formation, but their military bearing had softened over the months. They carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented. Captain Sullivan addressed the departing women with words that she later said were among the most difficult of her military career. "You came here as our enemies," she told them, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest of times." Ingrid, now serving as the unofficial spokesperson for those remaining, stood to respond. Her English had become fluent and confident over the months. "Captain Sullivan, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and hatred." The women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles that would take them to the port in Boston, then to ships bound for Europe. Tears were shed on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but they were journeys they had chosen rather than simply endured. For those remaining in America, the transition from prisoners to immigrants was challenging but rewarding. Ingrid found work as a translator for the State Department, helping to process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Her unique perspective, as someone who had been on both sides of the conflict, made her invaluable in bridging cultural and linguistic gaps. Anna completed her nursing certification and eventually became head nurse at Worcester General Hospital. Her story became locally famous, and she was often invited to speak to community groups about forgiveness and the possibility of transformation. She never married, dedicating her life instead to caring for others as a way of making amends for her country's actions during the war. The other women who remained found their own paths to contribution and belonging. Some married American soldiers they had met during their imprisonment, creating families that embodied the reconciliation between former enemies. Others pursued careers in teaching, social work, and business, always carrying with them the lessons they had learned about the power of human kindness to overcome hatred. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story was how they maintained connections with those who had returned to Germany. Letters flowed back and forth across the Atlantic, creating a network of women united by their shared experience of transformation. Those who had returned often wrote about the challenges of rebuilding their lives in devastated Germany, but also about how their experience in America had given them hope and resilience. Years later, when scholars began to study this unprecedented case of prisoners of war who chose to remain with their captors, they found that the story had influenced American policy toward occupied Germany. The kindness shown to these women had demonstrated the effectiveness of treating former enemies with dignity and offering genuine opportunities for redemption. 25 years after that unprecedented day, when German women prisoners begged to remain in American captivity, Ingrid Brenner Henderson stood before a gathering at the United Nations in New York. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the power of individual transformation to overcome historical hatred. Now an American citizen with grown children, she carried with her a small leather diary, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived at Fort Devens. Her speech that day would be remembered as one of the most moving testimonies ever given at the UN about the possibility of peace between former enemies. She spoke about the morning when Captain Sullivan announced their freedom to return to Germany, and how that announcement had forced them to confront the most important question of their lives. What did home truly mean? "We discovered," she told the international audience, "that home isn't just where you come from. It's where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. We found that forgiveness isn't something that's given to you. It's something you earn through your actions and your commitment to being better than you were before. The story of the German women who chose to stay had become more than just a historical curiosity. It had become a symbol of America's capacity for redemption and renewal, proof that even in the darkest times, people could choose to see past their hatred to recognize the humanity in their enemies. Anna Weber, by then Dr. Anna Weber, had returned to Germany in 1965 as part of a medical exchange program. She found a country transformed, rebuilt not just in its cities and infrastructure, but in its values and its commitment to human rights. She often said that her experience in American captivity had prepared her to appreciate how completely Germany had changed, because she had experienced her own complete transformation. The women who had originally chosen repatriation in 1945 had played their own crucial role in Germany's reconstruction. They carried with them stories of American kindness that helped convince other Germans that their former enemies could be trusted partners in building a better future. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen the bonds between the two countries. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of their story was its impact on how America viewed its responsibilities toward former enemies. The success of their integration influenced policies toward refugees and immigrants for decades to come. It demonstrated that America's greatest strength lay not in its military might, but in its capacity to offer second chances to those willing to embrace American values of dignity, opportunity, and redemption. As Ingrid concluded her UN speech, she held up that small leather diary that had accompanied her through her entire journey from enemy prisoner to American citizen. In this diary, she said, I wrote the questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become? The remarkable thing about America is that it gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given. The story of the German women who begged to stay reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, individual people can choose to write different endings for their own lives. It shows us that redemption is possible when societies are willing to offer it, and that the most powerful victory over hatred is the transformation of enemies into friends, of prisoners into citizens, of despair into hope. Today, their story continues to inspire new generations of Americans and Germans alike, proof that the human capacity for growth and change can overcome even the deepest divisions of war and hatred. They chose to stay not because they were seeking an easy escape from the consequences of their past, but because they had discovered in American captivity something they wanted to spend their lives defending and sharing with others.